Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Jade Frederickson, this is James Scott, and Dr. Rubenstein is also in the room, and the three of us worked on this study together, which was a retrospective inquiry into how COVID impacted agricultural students' experiences on a study abroad to Scotland and the UK. So in case anyone needs a refresher, I'll just recap a couple of events that happened at the beginning of 2020. At the end of January, the World Health Organization declared COVID to be a public health emergency of concern. And then on March 11th, that is when they declared COVID to be a global pandemic. Of course, I finally remember Friday the 13th, which normally I think of 13 as a lucky number for me. However, on this day, I don't know if that was such the case. That was when former President Donald Trump issued a travel ban, saying that either you should, one, avoid international travel, or two, return home as soon as possible. For students that were studying abroad, maybe because of college experience, high school experience, or related, also on break, or just having a vacation of some sort, they were away from home. And so this begs the question, what do we do? What does this mean for us? What does this look like now?
So as Jade mentioned, students were away from home during this time. This was spring break for a lot of college students. So our purpose of this study was to examine the impact of COVID-19 on college-age students' study abroad trip experience to the UK. So we had three research objectives that guided this study. Address participants' overall knowledge, thoughts, and experiences with COVID-19 prior to, during, and upon completion of the trip. To discern proactive, reactive, and latent expectations, reactions, and actions either because of or despite what we now know was a looming pandemic. And then to learn about COVID-19's impact on students' overall experiences in Scotland throughout the United Kingdom. So to give a little bit of background about the study abroad trip that we examined. So it's a study abroad trip in the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences at UGA. It's a Scotland Youth Engagement and Agriculture trip. This 2020 trip was an 8-day faculty-led trip to the UK over spring break. It's a partnership with Dumfries Schools and the University of Glasgow Dumfries campus faculty and students. And the experience entails students as they lead elementary school lessons in agriculture. They teach lessons to primary age students, which is 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And then they implement service learning projects in this school as well. They teach lessons on how to make butter, lessons on Vikings, and other experiences that they develop in the United States before traveling abroad. And this also gives them the opportunity to expand their worldviews. So to analyze or go back to our research objectives, we did individual interviews using a semi-structured interview protocol via Zoom. And they were 60 to 90-minute interviews that were audio recorded only. These participants that we had in the study were selected based on their range of study abroad experiences. So there were 12 students on this trip that went along with Dr. Rubenstein and another faculty advisor. And we ended up getting 3 students to participate in the study prior to the conference. After we submitted our abstract, we had another student that we interviewed and had their experience documented. And then we're still trying to get a few more to respond to us out of that group. Some of them are working as a teacher or an extension. Some of them have continued on into grad school, and some of them are finishing up their undergraduate right now. We utilize constant comparative method to identify our distinct themes. So upon completion of the interviews, we took our audio transcripts and implemented them into Atlas TI, and also used printed out versions to identify our distinct themes and form explanations.
Perfect. So I'll talk a little bit more about trustworthiness and rigor to kind of wrap up this section. We used several methods to kind of establish this reliability in this qualitative study, which, as we all know, looks a little bit different than quantitative. So we used pseudonyms. I'm sure many of you are like, I don't know what you just said. I think it's supposed to be pseudonyms, but I say pseudonyms, so I don't know. I apologize. We also did number checking and peer debriefing. So as James mentioned, we used constant comparative analysis. We both had our separate transcripts that we looked at. We coded, and then we came together, compared. How do these compare? What do you think? Is this a major theme or kind of a sub-theme? And then we went back and then finalized our list. We also, when we were doing that, I was transcribing during these interviews, so we referred back to these memo notes as well. Also, we considered, are these experiences relatable and generalizable? In general, I don't know that anyone's experience during COVID was necessarily generalizable in that they were all so unique, but did the emotions and did the experience kind of align with what you were feeling inside too? So we considered that. Also on a subjectivity note, we're both PhD students in the ALEC department, although neither of our backgrounds are in ALEC. We also had varying experiences during the start of the pandemic. For example, I was on a gap year fellowship, so not in school, and James was obtaining his master's and also working at a veterinary clinic. Now I'll talk a little bit about themes. So at the top you can see the darker bubbles. I don't know if it's coming through as well in this room, but the top 3 themes were thoughts prior to study abroad, COVID-19's impacts on, and then returning to the US. You can see the sub-themes listed below. We're going to talk about those a little bit more later on. You'll also notice that themes like general, naivety, the evolution of quarantine, and takeaways from the experience are a little bit bigger. We wanted to kind of represent how much different themes were talked about. And so these 3 larger bubbles, even though they were sub-themes, were where a majority of the participants, or rather where the participants spent a majority of their time talking about. So, yeah, I think those were 3 themes, sub-themes, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them.
Yeah, so going into that a little bit more, so starting with thoughts prior to study abroad. So using that semi-structured interview protocol, we interviewed these students, and in their discussion, these were the 3 big areas that we pulled out of their thoughts prior to study abroad. So as we all know, we were all pretty naive prior to the experience. So students talked a little bit about their general naivety about not knowing much about the pandemic, didn't think it was going to impact their trip much at all. You can see 2 quotes here from 2 of our respondents. Then we have our pre-trip excitement. So they were all pretty excited to go on this trip. No matter what COVID was going to do, they were all excited to go abroad, to experience teaching students and to experience just different cultures. Then we've got our student educational backgrounds and interests. So we had our 3 participants, Andrew, Jamie, and Stella. Andrew at the time was a senior ag ed major. He had no international travel prior or study abroad experience. We had Jamie, who was a senior biological science major. She had been on 2 prior study abroad experiences. And then we had Stella, who was a junior agricultural education student who had done prior international travel as a child, didn't really remember much about it, and then had no study abroad experiences before this.
Perfect. I'll talk a little bit about COVID-19's impact on. So remember, these were kind of the smaller bubbles. In general, we saw and heard from our participants that COVID-19 didn't actually have too much of an impact on the entire experience, which is where we saw like the general naivety and the 2 sub-themes coming out as really large. It was really before and after the trip. However, during the trip, there were some impacts on the actual teaching. So for example, they weren't able to go into the schools to teach. They were supposed to teach for about 4 days, and most of them only taught for 2 or 3 because of those restrictions that the government had kind of put on their teaching. And then also in touring, they noticed a few changes, some signage, some people wearing masks, and then also just being super aware of if someone coughed or what you were touching maybe on the subway.
So then as the students were coming back to the United States, they talked a lot about their experience returning on that flight back. So as Jade mentioned, that Friday the 13th was the day that Trump had begun to close borders. Students were still on the trip at that point. They began to get emails from the University of Georgia saying, hey, we're going to extend spring break 2 more weeks. And so there were a lot of moving parts with that. And so then as they were coming back, CDC said, hey, you've got to quarantine for these 2 weeks that you're coming back. Even though you haven't been in China, you still got to quarantine. So as Jade mentioned previously, we've got 2 big bubbles out of this return to the US, the abolition of quarantine. At the time, we didn't really know what quarantine meant. There's still a lot of confusion with quarantine nowadays of if you've been exposed to somebody, if you're vaccinated, not vaccinated, all that. So Andrew, Jamie, and Sal all talked a little bit about the evolution of their quarantine, about trying to figure out what they were going to do with classes, being lonely, the impact that it had on their mental health. And then the takeaways from the experience. So even though they had to quarantine upon their return, COVID did impact a little bit of things here and there, but not much. The big takeaways were that study abroad is a very good experience for students. Andrew, who had no prior experience, really enjoyed the trip. Stella and Jamie also enjoyed it. Stella talked about having an amazing time, still keeps up with the students in Dumfries and the students at the University of Glasgow. And then Jamie talked about how it changed her experience and how she knows to love people. The experience that she had in Scotland, they love their neighbor. They don't care what it happens. They're going to wear a mask. They're going to support. They want to hug everybody. So it's really changed her views of her experience in the United States here.
Great. I'll talk about our conclusions super briefly since I think we are about to run out of time in a minute or so. Information about COVID has dramatically increase. I don't know about you, I didn't expect it to still be standing here 2.5 years almost later. I remember kind of scoffing, like 18 months? No way, absolutely not. Also in red, so kind of summarizing on that thoughts prior to study abroad, hindsight is 2020. We didn't have the information, although if we did somehow, participants did need that information before leaving. In this darker blue, to go back to COVID-19's impacts on, very little impact on the actual trip itself. And then finally, our last theme that James just spent a good bit of time talking about, pivoting, was a big theme. So we needed to move, we needed to be flexible. Preparing for quarantine was a laughable thought. Absolutely no way, unless you were one of the Southerners that bought up all the toilet paper. I'm not sure you would have been much more prepared. And then finally, quarantine, as James just said, has changed significantly. It looks a lot different now. We have a lot different concerns, and just kind of how we prepare for that.
Yeah, so taking those conclusions, so we developed 2 recommendations for future research here. One is to conduct interviews with students who engaged in or did not engage in the study abroad trips that occurred around the same time period. So a lot of the students that were on this trip, or the 3 that we interviewed, talked a lot about coming back and being on the same plane with students that were part of UGA's trip to Oxford for the entire semester. Students that were also on the plane were from other spring break trips or half semester trips. So getting some experience knowledge from them and how COVID impacted their trip. Then looking at those students that either their trip was going to be later in that semester or over the summer, how did COVID impact that? What happened to the funding that they were going to receive if they were getting scholarships? Did they get to postpone it and potentially go the next year? What if they were graduating? So looking at that and then examining and articulating the experience of engaging in the study abroad trip shortly before, during, and now immediately following. So even at UGA, last year study abroad trips were canceled again. I was helping Dr. Rubenstein in planning the one that we were supposed to go on last year, which we were modifying a little bit, working with UGA to try to get it still to be approved. Everything ended up getting canceled. So even this year, even though it's not immediately following the declaration of the pandemic, even getting these students experiences that are going on study abroad trips this year, whether that be semester long or a week long or over the summer or however that may be. So these are our 2 future recommendations for research. So thank you. Any questions?
Can you clarify, and you probably said it and I missed it, what was the time frame? So the students they were in the UK for how long before they were pulled back? This was in 2020?
Yeah, so March 2020. So they were enrolled in the course in that spring semester of 2020. They left, I believe, on March 6th. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we left on the 6th, which was a Friday evening. We were there Thursday morning. We received the information that all other trips in the European Union had been canceled and that everyone immediately needed to return back to the United States. So all of my students, while we were there in the UK, received these text messages from their friends that were in other parts of the EU, and they were then in turn freaking out. I mean, we had a lot of parent communications that they were wondering what we were doing and why we weren't coming home, and that was because we weren't required to. And the university told us to stay. And so, and where we were located, it's about it's a 4.5 hour train ride to get back to London, which is where our flight was supposed to leave from. So there was just no way to make it any shorter than what it already was. So when we got back to London, that's when we then received announcements that they were going to close all travel from the UK. So within the UGA system, we were the last study abroad program to return back to the United States. It was an interesting experience.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, that was a great presentation, but I do have a question concerning like the mental health. And I know that can be a rather contentious topic, but I was a student at UGA at the time, and I had several friends that were on a mission trip overseas and got the immediate text message, and it had several mental health implications to the students that you had interviewed. Did they talk about any mental health implications from like these immediate texts and just the general worriness of the COVID pandemic and not knowing how to get home and such?
Yeah, so actually 2 of the participants talked about that a lot. One of them at the time was a pre-med student, and so she talked about getting that email communication and trying to call her mom, and she said she took a second to go to the bathroom and she had to pay to go to the bathroom and was crying in the bathroom trying to call her mom, trying to figure out what she could do, how she could get her books. She was an RA, how she could get her books out of her dorm, how she could get her computer, whatever it was. And so she said she had several breakdowns at that point when they first received the notifications. And then upon returning, trying to figure out all the moving parts of, okay, my parents weren't able to get this out of my dorm, but I've still got a quarantine. Where do I go? And who's picking me up from the airport? So there are a lot of moving parts, and she talked a lot about how she was stressed, had several breakdowns, and then even coming back, she lived in her grandparents' attic, basically, or a room above a garage, didn't have any contact with anybody. And Jade and I remarked several times about, she made a comment about waking up at like 3 a.m. to go shower because she was just having a breakdown and needed to take a cold shower because she was freaking out so much during that 2-week time period. So they both of those students talked a lot about that.
And if I can add on to that really quickly as well, James, when we were talking about kind of were these experiences relatable and generalizable, obviously everyone in this room was not on a study abroad, but I think especially when we consider that mental health aspect of what did these abroad experiences mean for that mental health aspect, is that I think we can all relate to those feelings of what happens next.
Other questions? Okay.
Well, real quick,
Yeah.
so as UGA, and maybe y'all can answer this as well, Dr. Rubenstein, have they implemented some policies about like what you'll do now when you study abroad if there's like an emergency?
So the new policy at the University of Georgia, and I hope this isn't going to be recorded, so it's a little mixed. Basically, what we have to do is we're to follow guidelines from the country that we're traveling to. And so, at least in the United Kingdom, there is no testing requirements. We're getting ready to go back in June for the first time, and it'll be a 2-week trip this year. And the requirement was originally that they had to test as soon as they arrived. That's now been removed. So basically, the university is warning us, based on prior experiences from fall study abroad trips, that when you test, or when you have to test, you need to have a contingency plan in case, because someone will test positive. So the situation that we're in is we are now required to secure them housing for a 2-week quarantine, and then make sure that they are okay, contact the university, who will contact the travel insurance company that we have, and then we are to move on. And so that student is then set, so we need to make sure that they have accommodations, and they need to make sure that they have meals, that they can get meals, and then the travel insurance company will ensure that a parent can fly to the United Kingdom to then spend the 2 weeks in a separate hotel room taking care of them.
Wow.
So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting situation, I think, for the first year at least, to see how we do that and how that all manifests. But luckily on our trip, the only time we have to test right now is to come back to the United States. So I can take care of that in London. That's a whole lot easier than some places. And there's one trip that they're required to test every 2 days when they're in country. And so they have to make, and on that trip, they are visiting 6 countries in 12 days. And so they are literally, every country they have to have something set up as to what they're going to do when a student tests. If the student tests positive, how are they going to accommodate that student? So, and sadly in our case, so we're required to take a second person. So for example, James is my second person this year. So when that person tests positive, I leave him, take the rest of the students, and we move on. He catches up to us after he gets everything taken care of. And so
Congratulations.
In some cases, they're now talking, because of some of these moving pieces, they're now talking about trying to take at least 2 TAs to go along with the trip, because, it could take him 2 days to get everything set up, and if I had to test again, and I've got another student set, now I've got 17 more students that can't move on. So I don't know, it is going to be a mess, but we're going to give it a shot. We'll see what it looks like.
Not me.
Yeah.
So it knows, but